From codex creep and OP stratagems to seasonal updates, it seems the only way that Games Workshop can think to balance their game is by cramming more rules into it. But what if there was a way to make the game simpler while also retaining individuality for each of the individual factions? Today I'll be discussing one way that we might do just that, and all it involves is changing these into these. Welcome to Hobby with Ollie, my name is Ollie, and today we're going to try and discuss Warhammer 40k without our reliable old six-sided dice. Now before we jump into this, there's probably a lot of you thinking, what's wrong with a six-sided dice? Inherently, nothing. Six-sided dice, referred to as D6s or just dice by regular folk, are a ubiquitous part of all kinds of games. Now Warhammer is no exception, with the 9th edition of the game requiring D6 rolls to determine everything from successfully channeling a psychic power to whether or not you fall in a hole and die. This gives you a series of outcomes from 1 to 6, with a 6 representing a heroic success and a 1 representing a devastating failure. Now much of the time this is enough. 6 different potential outcomes allows an elite space marine to be much better firing his bolter than a random gun-crazed orc, or for a chaos lord in demonically fused, artisanally crafted armour to have a much better save than a guardsman with little more than the clothes on his back. Take the example of the orc and the marine. Traditionally, space marines hit on the roll of a 3+. This means they're more likely than not to hit their target with each roll of their weaponry. Orcs, on the other hand, they only hit on a 5+, meaning only about a third of the time are they going to be able to turn their dice into hits. So it's a good job that they bring weapons that do a lot of hits. Okay, so far, so 40k. But in addition, an ever-increasing number of rules is changing these fundamental characteristics to allow things like rerolls or pluses or minuses to the dice. For example, a Space Marine captain allows units within 6 inches to reroll 1s to hit. Now this doesn't sound like much, but it takes an average 3+ hitting Space Marine from a 66% chance to hit all the way up to a 78% chance to hit with each shot. Now in isolation, these rules have always been a part of Warhammer 40k and are part of what makes it a really fun and engaging game. However, in fringe or niche cases, which unfortunately due to the rules bloat of 40k seem to be becoming more and more common, it can be difficult to determine using a D6 just how much more elite or how much hardier one model is than another. Basically, if it ends up with everyone hitting on a 2+ and having a 2+ save, it might as well be that nobody does, because everyone's pretty much the same. So what does Games Workshop do to avoid this problem? For an example, let's look at Deathwing Terminators, who seem to be in a very, very powerful spot at the time of recording. They're supposed to be the best of the best, able to shrug off all but the most grievous of wounds. Without any special rules, they have the same 2+ save as most characters in most armies, the same 2+ save as a regular Terminator squad in any other chapter that's not Dark Angels, and the same 2+ save as a Tau Empire Crisis battlesuit. Shh, don't tell the Emperor. Now, in order to make sure that units feel distinct and different from one another, Games Workshop incorporates rules to plug the gaps to allow things like the Deathwing to feel as hardy and resilient as they're meant to be. At the moment, they get the Inner Circle rule, which allows them to ignore wound rolls from the enemy of a roll of 1 to 3. Now, in a lot of cases, for example this one, I think this can be a really flavourful and thematic rule. However, it is hard to ignore the fact that for new players, all of these little rules and extra bits for each of the different units on the table can be quite confusing. This leads us on to talking about different dice. What is the advantage to using a dice with a different number of sides? Well, the main reason is that you've got more different results that you can roll. Rather than relying on a rule to tell you how much hardier Deathwing Terminators are than other Terminators, what's stopping us from changing to a D10 system, where Terminators have a 4+ save and Deathwing Terminators have a 3+ save? Now for most people, it's probably easier to directly compare like for like that a 4+ save is worse than a 3+ save, rather than having to pore through all of the different special rules and see how they stack up against each other. Now the more sides you have on your dice, the more different results you can have. Famously, games like Dungeons & Dragons rely on a D20 for making a lot of their rolls. This allows for a large discrepancy in the amount of success or failure for each roll. Let's take an example where a character is leaping across a chasm. On the roll of a 1, they fall to the bottom of the chasm, taking catastrophic damage or maybe even dying. On the roll of a 2 to 5, maybe they fail but fall down a short way, taking an amount of damage. On a 5 to 10, they might succeed, but suffer some small penalty. On a 10 to 19, they might succeed, get across to the other side successfully, and then that leaves us with the roll of a natural 20. In this example, maybe they backflip across the chasm before landing to a rapturous round of applause while also pressing the like and subscribe button on this video. Now, am I saying that 40k should adopt D20s? Probably not, for a few reasons that I'll cover a bit later on, but it is an interesting thought experiment to think about what other dice 40k could adopt and how that would change the way we play the game. What I thought might be interesting is changing our beloved D6 to a D12. I'm going to be starting by looking at the characteristics represented as dice rolls on character profiles. So that's going to be weapon skill, ballistic skill, and the save characteristic. I'm also going to be focusing on the army that I know best, which is Space Marines. I know that a lot of people have played or played against Space Marines in the past, so hopefully this gives a good yardstick. Let me know if you'd like me to explore this topic more in the comments down below and leave your suggestions for what types of units could fall into each bracket for your army. I'm also going to be keeping the rules as similar to current 40k as possible. So the roll of a 1 is still going to fail, meaning the best that we're going to have is a weapon skill, ballistic skill, or save of 2+. With all that said, let's take a look at weapon skill. On a 12+ are for weak or feeble non-combatants, people who can pick up a pointy stick if required to, but they require the most miraculous of strikes to hit anything. On an 11+, you might have something like a servitor, something below the power of a human, but still able to fight a little bit better than a weak or feeble person. At a 10+, you have average humans or guardsmen. A 9+ is for elite close combat humans. An 8+ is where you get your Space Marine scouts. And at 7+, less combat-focused squads like Eliminators or Eradicators. Here we can see one of the advantages of this system. Models that are from a more ranged discipline might have a worse weapon skill to compensate for the fact that they're specialised into using ranged weaponry. At a 6+, we have our average Space Marine troops. Now, the more maths savvy among you will notice that this makes it a bit less likely for a Space Marine to hit. I think in general, it might be more interesting to have fewer things that always hit the target all the time, as being able to fail is one of the really cool things about Warhammer 40k, even though most people really don't like it a lot of the time. It's one of the reasons why I'm very much in the camp that the command point reroll stratagem should be removed, as it takes away a lot of the randomness and the actual intention of the game. If you fire a gun and it misses, it shows that the shot has gone wide, whereas if you can just re-roll it, it's kind of like rewinding time, meaning that none of it has any real impact anyway. That's just my opinion. Let me know if you agree in the comments. At a 5+, you get a lieutenant level Space Marine, someone who's been able to work their way up the ranks and prove themselves in martial combat. At a 4+, we have a captain or chapter master level Space Marine. You might also change this to be something from a chapter that's more combat focused, like Space Wolves or Blood Angels or something like that. At a 3+, you'd have a superior combatant, a less combat focused Primarch, for example, or maybe some other form of demigod from another army. At a 2+, you'd have something like a Titan, or those fully combat focused Primarchs like Angron. This way, it shows that only the best of the best have a 2+ weapon skill. Now, it's a similar idea here for ballistic skill, with a 12+ being for weak or feeble non-combatants that couldn't hit the side of a barn door with a large ordnance blast, all the way down to ranged focused Primarchs or demigods. Now, in here I also threw in things like assassins at a 3+, as their whole thing is being able to hit their targets, while the things like the chapter master level would be for those armies that are a little more ranged focus. Maybe the Raven Guard if they've got sniper rifles, or the Imperial Fists who are really focused on bolter discipline. Lastly, on saves, it becomes a lot easier to differentiate between different levels of armour. You could say a 12+ is little more than rags, so barely any save against whatever weaponry is coming at them. Whereas all the way down at a 2+, that shows someone that's nearly invulnerable. Now, I'd love to play a game using rules similar to these. If you are interested in me trying that out, let me know in those comments below, and I'll make it happen. Now, this is a fun experiment, but there are problems to address with any change to the system. Now, let's say hypothetically that Games Workshop changed their plan for 10th edition Warhammer 40k to say it's all going to be D12 based. I don't think they will, just to clarify, but let's imagine they did. Now, first off, is going to be a big shock to the system. For years and years and years, Space Marines have been hitting on a 3+. However, in my new proposed system, they hit on a 6+. This is going to be very jarring to a lot of people who have history with the game, and so I find it unlikely that they would make such a drastic change. Also, at a glance, a casual player has much less idea that a 6+ is any good as compared with a 3+. People are conditioned to understand D6 dice as they're everywhere throughout pop culture and in the rest of their lives. However, I don't actually see this being the biggest problem with people changing over to a D12 system. The much bigger issues are twofold, and both of them actually relate to the volume of dice required to play a game like Warhammer 40k. Firstly, and probably simplest of all, most people don't have massive collections of D12s lying around. As mentioned before, the D6 is everywhere, and so it's likely to take a long time for people to change over. People also have large collections of D6s, which, if you've ever bought a set from Games Workshop, don't exactly come cheap. The second reason, and it's also significant that the D6 is everywhere, the D6 is the easiest shape to roll in large numbers, and it's also very easy for us to process the information. We see the pips on a 6-sided dice, and we can immediately see whether we've rolled enough 5+s, for example. This allows us to gather up handfuls of dice without spending hours and hours poring over the results in a game of Warhammer 40k. And let's be honest, the last thing we need is a game taking any longer than it does at the moment. All in all, it's a fun thought experiment to think about something like this and ways that Games Workshop can simplify the game by changing it rather than just continuing to add more and more rules bloat that's going to be more and more difficult for new players to get involved with. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of my interpretation of a D12 40k. In the meantime, my name has been Ollie, this has been my hobby, and I'll see you next time. Oh, also, you may have noticed, finally finished the hobby room. I've got my Blood Angels print up. Excitement.